Today is Tuesday, July 14th, and my name is Ashley Hampton, class of 2010, and I am here today at McGraw-Page Library with Mr. Ira Andrews, who is the former Dean of Students here at the college and also a former professor of religious studies. Could you tell us a little bit about just how you came to Randolph-Macon and how you started?
Yes, actually I was invited to Randolph-Macon in 1963, just a year after I had finished graduate school. President Moreland called and invited me back for a 3-year stint teaching in the Department of Bible, as it was then, before it was religious studies. So my wife and I and a new baby moved here in 1963 for 3 years. Mm-hmm. Well, 3 years, as it turns out, became 43 years when I retired in 2006. As I said, I came as a member of the department, a member of the faculty. But in 1966, there were changes in the administration, and a part of those changes meant that the person who was sitting in the chaplain seat moved into development/advancement, and part of that turnover was an invitation to move into the dean's office, which I did, maintaining an opportunity to teach a course every semester in the department, which I did for 36 years. So I've spent my career here and have been in a way a link between the Virginia Conference and the church, not in a formal way, but because of my position at the college and the fact that I served on a number of boards and agencies of the Virginia Conference over a number of years.
Okay. Would you like to talk a little bit more about your involvement with the conference and the conference's relationship with the college?
Yeah, the college, as you know well from the interviews and your reading, the conference and the college, the conference was involved in the creation of Randolph-Macon in 1829, 1830. Mm-hmm. Lay people in the conference and officials of the conference, clergy, wanted to create a college for young men, as it were, at that time. So Methodists figured very importantly in the origins of Randolph-Macon. But from the beginning, the college was chartered by the Commonwealth of Virginia, and the college was set up with a board of trustees that was independent and self-perpetuating. That is to say, the college was not created as a church school. Mm-hmm. It is related to the church, but it is not a church school in the sense that the church exercised authority or control over the college through its board of trustees. So that's been the guiding principle, not merely a principle, but a fact of life in the relationship between the college and the conference, which has proved to be on several occasions problematic and controversial. We don't need to go into that because you read all about that situation. But in more recent decades, it was controversial because members of the conference felt some proprietary interest in the college, in as much as they provide some funding to Randolph-Macon and to the other 5 institutions in the Commonwealth that are a part of the Virginia Annual Conference. They have given us a couple $100,000 a year. That's what it was now. It was a small amount in other years, but nevertheless they felt that entitled them to some say in how things have gone, and that proved to be a bone of contention for some period of time. Mm-hmm. When I say that I was provided, I think, some linkage between the conference and the college, it's because I'm ordained in the United Methodist Church, and I'm a member of the Virginia Annual Conference. And from the beginning, from the earliest days of my tenure at Randolph-Macon, I served on conference boards and agencies for a number of years, 12 years about. I was involved with the Board of Higher Education and Campus Ministry and served for for 8 years as president of that board. That provided a direct linkage. When I was in that capacity, I served on the governing body, the program governing body of the Virginia Conference, and did work on a number of special task forces for the bishop. Served on the conference for 12 years on the annual conference Board of Ordained Ministry, which governs and controls the movement of folks into the ordained relationship. Served on the Board of Discipleship of the annual conference for 4 years. So over my career, I have been, in a way, only because of the fact that I happen to be ordained and here as a point, linkage point between the annual conference and the church. Mm-hmm. Early on, that wasn't so important, because beginning in 1960, Randolph-Macon had a full-time chaplain hired by the college. Before 1960, the college did not have a chaplain who was paid on the payroll of Randolph-Macon. The role of chaplain was fulfilled to some extent by the pastor who was appointed to Duncan Memorial. You know from other conversations that the church and the college have had a close relationship, very close, because they shared the old chapel. Some college money and some local money was used to construct the old chapel. Mm-hmm. Because the Duncan Memorial congregation needed a church. The place they had been worshiping had burned, and they needed a church. The college needed a building, so they pooled resources and created that, and they shared that old chapel building for, good grief, until 1950, right, when the new building was constructed. Duncan Memorial Church was constructed. Mm-hmm. So the two have been in a close relationship forever. And the pastor served, again, not as a paid employee, but served in effect as a chaplain to the college. Mm-hmm. During that time, during those years, hiring practices in higher education were very different than they are now. The president essentially served as a committee of one. Perhaps he had some folks working with him to fill faculty and staff positions, so that there was much more, if you will, control over who came and who went on the faculty and staff. That meant, and that's before government regulations, which prevent one from talking about certain things with prospective employees, applicants for positions. Okay. Before the federal government guidelines for employment, you could pay attention to those issues. And for a church school, that meant you could pay attention to whether someone is a church person or not, denominationally or otherwise. And I think the president Randolph-Macon, was sensitive to that issue, because Earl Moreland, was himself very actively involved with the church, not only locally, but in the Virginia Conference and nationally. I think he was very involved with the World United Methodist Church. So that was an issue that was a matter of some importance to him. Mm-hmm. And he hired folks who reflected those interests and those concerns of his. When I was a student here, I was trying the other night to recall, to enumerate folks who were on the faculty or staff here who were very active in Duncan Memorial Church. Mm-hmm. And there were a fair number of those. You may have counted those for yourself, and you may have that information.
I did. They're actually recorded in, I think it's Marion Herget's history of Duncan.
History of Duncan Memorial, mm-hmm. Exactly. So you know that there were a lot of folks here who were very important people in Duncan Memorial Church. Mm-hmm. Well, that changed. That began to change fairly significantly in the 60s, and it has continued to change. And in part, In part, not totally, I think, in part because of federal guidelines precluding asking questions about religious affiliation, et cetera, et cetera, in part. The other part is, I think, the college's intention, not erroneously, to broaden its reach in terms of constructing a faculty and staff to be broadly ecumenical with a little e without regard to religion. Having said that, I think it's perfectly legitimate for institutions that are related to church bodies, to denominational bodies, to pay attention to that. It doesn't have to be the make or break point in a hiring decision, but it seems to me that we don't have to be neutral. And there are a number of institutions we could cite. Among them, Davidson. Davidson College makes a very, used to, I assume it still does, it was very important for them to have a faculty that was comfortable with and felt that they could work in an environment where a student body and a college was related in an active way to a denomination. In their case, United Presbyterian Church of the U.S. Mm-hmm. So gradually, that fact of life, namely of having lots of folks who were Methodist here, began to diminish. People died, or they moved away, and replacements were looked differently than they'd had in the previous, 60 or 80 years.
Okay. I remember reading part of Professor Scanlon's new book, talking about the covenant, and part of the covenant was talking about that the college or the faculty would be supportive of, I don't remember the exact wording, but Methodist ideology or the teachings of the Methodist Church or something along those lines. And then that was kind of like a point of tension.
Yep.
Could you talk a little bit more about the covenant, and was that maybe the conference's way of trying to revert back to those earlier times?
Yeah, you're very astute. Many in the colleges felt that was, to use a colloquialism, that was a camel's nose under the tent. That there was a change in the metaphor, that's a roundabout way of the annual conference inserting itself into the college's affairs. That was Randolph-Macon's perspective, not in necessarily a negative way. Our feeling wasn't suspicious that this was happening, but there was some concern, particularly on the part of attorneys on the board of trustees, one of whom happened to be a very active United Methodist layperson. The concern was that if the college were to sign that covenant as the covenant was drafted, then at some point it could become a matter of contention, and a court might determine that having signed that covenant, the college invited the church to participate in in institutional governance in some way. Okay. So the college, Randolph-Macon and the Women's College, those two colleges were very cool to the idea of the covenant, not because they wished to disengage from the conference, but because they were very very aware of their own autonomy, of their sort of constitutional by charter independence, and they were not willing to do that because it might forfeit their independence, though that may not have been what the intention was coming from the on the annual conference side. So it was a point of tension because the annual conference felt it was innocuous. Well, maybe, but maybe not. Mm-hmm. And this college and Women's College, the two of them were not willing, and we weren't operating in tandem. We had our own view, and they had their own view. Right. But our views were very similar. We just didn't want to run that risk. So that caused some tension, and it probably exacerbated some of the other feelings that some members of the conference had that are referred to issues about student drinking and the college's reluctance to and unwillingness to create a dry campus, etc., which would be a part of the historical United Methodist tradition. For example, the WCTU, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, was a national organization back in the Prohibition era, which attempted to fight alcoholism, a very worthy cause. Many of the key members of the old WCTU were Methodist women, so that sort of strain runs through a conservative part of the United Methodist Church. Methodism is a big umbrella. Lots of different kind of people. Some people say, a friend of mine used to say, try Methodism, a thinking person's church. In the sense, what he meant by that is that you don't have to park your brain at the door. Methodism is a denomination where there is considerable latitude in terms of theological thinking, the application of social teaching, et cetera, et cetera. So, but that was a point of tension.
Okay. I guess moving on. Well, going with the conference relationship, did you see it? Would you say that it just changed during your time as dean of students, or would you say that it weakened, or how would you describe the change that happened?
Well, I think that change is probably an appropriate word, and I think the annual conference and the college were not as closely related, began to be less closely related in the 60s, and I think that continued for a couple of decades or more. And in part it continued because the thing we've talked about before, the hiring of faculty and staff paid much less attention to religious affiliation. Now, when the chaplaincy was created in 1960, President Moreland obviously and intentionally hired a member of the annual conference, a clergy member of the annual conference as chaplain here. In 1966, when the change to which I've referred earlier was made, that moved me into the Dean of Students office, that also involved the hiring of a new chaplain who was a United Methodist clergy person. So that we still maintained a good relationship, a more formalized relationship through the office of the chaplain during that era. It was in the early 1980s that the current chaplain was hired, who is not a United Methodist, and that has been a point, I think, of some contention. I was responsible for hiring the current chaplain, and if I were doing it today, and all things were today as they were then, I would have hired the chaplain, Darrell Hedrick, again, because in the pool of people who were available, students who were an important part of that interview process, and others felt that we hired the person who was best. What's interesting about that, and unfortunate, is that conversations with the chaplain, who was a Southern Baptist, had been underway, which those conversations, if they could have been realized, would have created a situation in which his ordination could have been recognized by the Virginia Conference, and he would have become a United Methodist. On the fly in the ointment was that the then bishop of the Virginia Conference, was profoundly unhappy that I did not hire, the college did not hire a member of the annual conference who had been in the candidate pool. it was doubly unfortunate because the bishop happened to be a good friend of that young man, whom I like very much. The young man, I know him, I had known him, and I admire and respect him. The fact is that students and others here felt that on balance, the person we hired was the best person, would be the best fit for Randolph-Macon. Well, the bishop was very perturbed at that, and because he was in a position to effect this transfer that we had been hoping for, decided not to be cooperative, and he would have required the chaplain they hire to go through 3 or 4 hoops in order to do what it could have been done with a signature on a piece of paper. And the chaplain, and I supported him in that, said, I'm not going to do that. So what we had thought might have worked out in an amicable way to have a Methodist chaplain here didn't turn out to be the case for reasons beyond our control. And I think that was a point of some tension. The other piece, though, as we've talked about, was the gradual the changes in the faculty in which church relationship or church personship, churchmanship in the old language, was not a significant factor, if a factor at all, in hiring, played itself out. And that was that was a part of a conscious decision on the college's part. I feel unfortunate and unnecessary, but that's sort of how things went. The presidents of the institution moved it in that direction. Whether that will change in any way in the foreseeable future is anyone's guess. But I continue to personally hold the view that we can pay attention to our relationship with the church. And I think one place at which that could be done very easily is in every position description which is in position descriptions that are advertised. Our relationship to the United Methodist Church could have a more prominent place. I don't think you have to say we favor that, but I think there are ways of communicating that this is an institution which has a historic relationship to the United Methodist Church, so the folks who are coming can know that. Now, furthermore, I think we can talk about it as a church-related institution. We don't have to forget that. We can talk. I think it's legal for us to do that if we wish to. And I think that's a point at which the institution could take some small and, I believe, innocuous steps that would have some impact on the nature of the faculty and the staff. But with my opinion and $3, you can buy a cup of mocha at Starbucks.
Okay. Well, moving on from faculty, since you were the Dean of Students, could you talk a little bit about maybe the shift in the student body from being predominantly Methodist and maybe the religious life on campus, organizations, pre-ministerial students?
Yeah, that's an interesting point, and I don't have data at my fingertips about the percentage of United Methodists who were in the student body.
I don't have specific numbers, but I do know that it decreased from what I've seen.
For example, when I was here in the 50s, I could not tell you how many of that student body of 550 people were Methodists, and how many were Baptists, and how many were Roman Catholic, and whatever. That data is available. You could find that in catalogs.
I found some in the president's reports. But for the most part, it was they just listed Methodists, Catholics, Jews, and then other. So, and for a while, Methodists and Catholics were close, and then I think Maybe
That's right.
it was toward the 80s, and even Professor Hedrick said this. I think Catholics are now the majority on
I
campus.
think that's right. But
So,
if you have a few minutes, you might look in catalogs from the 40s
okay.
and 50s.
Mm-hmm.
Because if I recall correctly, in those catalogs, and they were almost all of them were yellow, but a nice pale yellow,
Mm-hmm.
lemon and gold,
Lemon and
lemon and
black.
black were way on
Right.
high. I think, as I remember, there's a page that indicates
Really?
religious affiliation.
Okay.
I'm not, I wouldn't bet $100 on it, but I'd bet $20. That's there.
Okay.
Now, having said that, I think I do agree with Professor Hedrick.
Mm-hmm.
That began to change, and I'm not sure really why it changed. Um, I have a hunch that one of the factors in the change um, is that as college costs increased, Methodist people, because we weren't appealing at that point. We were appealing to rank and file as opposed to the social economic elite, as it
Mm-hmm.
were. The Methodist people began, and some others, Baptists and others, began seeing sticker shock. Well, what's going on is that many Roman Catholic families had been paying parochial school tuition.
Mm-hmm.
They were accustomed to paying for their children's education.
Okay.
So they weren't turned off or turned away by paying significant tuition costs.
Mm-hmm.
I think that was going on. It wasn't on the college's part. It wasn't a decision by admissions people to consciously exclude or create barriers for others, because we were then um, um, blind with respect to admissions. There was no quota system. We have to have so many Presbyterians, so many Lutheran. No,
Right.
it wasn't that. I think there were more societal factors at play than there were institutional factors at play in the gradual diminution of the number of United Methodists who were here. Um, so right now, you're right, Catholics are the greatest number. One of the things that may have contributed to that is decisions made by the college about where they were going to do recruitment.
Okay.
Um, with a limited staff,
Mm-hmm.
the premium was on going where you're going to see the most people,
Mm-hmm.
and not spending time in Methodist churches.
Mm-hmm.
I think that probably over time had some influence. We were not as visible, and some other conference schools are like that. I have a feeling that if we would look at the student body at Wesleyan,
Mm-hmm.
at Randolph-Macon Women's College, and maybe at Shenandoah, you'll find a breakdown of religious affiliation of students that's not going to be very, very different from Randolph-Macon's.
Okay.
I have a sneaking feeling that that'd be true, and I
Mm-hmm.
think that probably is true in many denominational schools,
Mm-hmm.
unless they are schools that are avowedly Methodist or Presbyterian or whatever, and make a concerted effort
Mm-hmm.
to create a student body which is reflective of that particular tradition, and there are some.
Mm-hmm.
But for schools that are like Randolph-Macon, that are educational institutions and not churches,
Okay.
that's what we are. We're not a church. We're an educational institution.
Mm-hmm.
I think you'll find a wide spread of denominational representation.
Was the college still being promoted in the church when you first came, or is it now, or was that more in the 50s?
That's a good question. A couple of we'll answer it in two ways. One,
Okay.
I think the colleges were promoted through an annual conference office. The colleges didn't self-promote, but they
Mm-hmm.
were assisted by an annual conference office, a part-time officer.
Mm-hmm.
The annual conference had a number of capital campaigns for higher education institutions. That's how Duncan Memorial Church was built, for example.
Mm-hmm.
That's how Haley Hall was constructed. That's how Crenshaw Gym was constructed. annual conference had a big capital funds campaign, and the institutions in the conference were the beneficiaries of that capital funds campaign.
Okay.
Fascinating. That's before the institutions did it on their own. Now, as again in the '60s and into the '70s, especially, that began to change.
Mm-hmm.
The other part of that question was what?
Is it still promoted in the churches?
Yeah. An organization exists now to publicize the institutions through the annual conference. But the institutions, my hunch is, we don't. The institutions no longer, in a direct way, go to churches or to districts, etc. They put literature out. They may have someone at a conference events where there are lots of young people. Some probably do that more faithfully than others, and that may be beneficial in some ways. I don't know, but it seems to me that that's a place you could spend some money, could spend some time. Time is money, but you could spend some staff time at such events with a physical presence, and that might be a way of connecting with young people who are beginning to think about college.
Okay.
Seems to me.
Do you remember some of the student organizations that were active on campus?
Yeah, we wanted to talk about the clericus.
Right, clericus,
Yeah.
and
In the 40s, 50s, and into the 60s at Randolph-Macon, and at Wesleyan wasn't here then, but at Ferrum, I'm sure there was an organization here called the Clericus for preministerial students, and that group was run by students. It had a faculty advisor. Typically, that was for Randolph-Macon the unofficial chaplain of the college, the campus, the minister of Duncan Memorial, until the 50s when a minister, when a clergy person who was in the Department of Religion served as a kind of director of religious activities. That person would give some, when I provide an adult present for the clericus, but it was essentially a student-run organization of guys who were going into the ministry, because they were all guys in until 71, 72. It was a robust organization. Lots of students, 20 or 30, belonged to that organization. It was a very powerful organization. For example, it participated. Clericus, I was a member of the Clericus, and we had teams in intramurals. So student organizations did, but Clericus had enough people to field teams in all the intramural activities. Now, when Methodist students began to decline, that coincided with, I think, across the churches, denominations, a diminution of emphasis on quote unquote Christian vocations. Churches began talking less about that in local churches, and I think those two things combined to cause the clericus here to go out of business, because fewer students came to college here and other places knowing or having a sense that they were called to ministry. So I think the confluence of those two things, a lack of emphasis by the churches and the smaller numbers of denominational folks, created a situation in which the clericus eventually sort of dried out, went out of business. Now, in more recent years, with the emergence of the Bailey program at Randolph-Macon, clericus has tried to make a beginning, because one of the things that the program wanted to do was, in a self-conscious way, was to create a group where all the Bailey students and any other preministerial student could come together to talk about matters of mutual interest. And I think in some years it's worked pretty well, some years it hasn't worked so well. So now I think what's happening is that the Bailey program coordinator invites other preministerial students to come to some of those activities. You don't have to be a Bailey to participate in some of those things. So there's a kind of de facto clericals organization without having a separate organization for the clericals.
Okay. Do you remember your time here, the faculty being involved in student religious life on campus?
Well, during the
Or
time
sponsoring.
when lots of faculty at Randolph-Macon were members of Duncan Memorial, that was the case. I don't remember this, but in the 40s, there was and 30s and 40s, and maybe back into the 20s, there was a very active YMCA on the campus. You can look back in the catalogs and you'll see the YMCA listings of offices, etc. And I don't know very much about that. I know nothing about that, except that there was a YMCA and that faculty were involved in some way with students. But to the extent that there were faculty, a number of faculty and staff at Duncan Memorial, yeah, they were involved with students, because lots of students in those days, a fair number of students, went to Duncan Memorial and were a presence in town, because it was not until after World War II that the college had a dining hall. So all students took their meals in the town of Ashland in private homes.
Oh, the boarding houses.
Boarding houses, exactly right, exactly right. So people began to know each other beyond the bounds of the college campus. But I think faculty were involved to a greater extent with student religious activities, because they were involved with Duncan Memorial.
Okay. Could you talk a little bit about chapel and how chapel requirements changed and how that maybe changed the atmosphere on campus?
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about that, maybe not exactly the way in which you had framed the question.
Okay.
When I was a student, everybody says that, but as a student here, life was very different. We went to class 6 days a week. We had classes on Saturday morning from 8 o'clock until noon. What are you shaking your head for, a woman?
That's crazy. Saturday?
Oh, yeah. It was 6 days a week we were in class. Another interesting part of it was that there were 2 times a week when there was an assembly period. Student body gathered and assembled together in Blackwell Auditorium. For me, Blackwell was built in 1953. We met in Blackwell, and students, it was amazing. Students tended to sit in 2 places, and faculty sat in another. Those assemblies provided a wonderful opportunity for the whole community to gather, and it was required attendance. You could cut 2 or 3 times, whatever, but attendance was required, and you had to sign a little chit that you were there, and they took them up and recorded them, and as a matter of discipline. The majority of those assemblies were not religious. Some were chapels, and some took place in the chapel. Some took place in Duncan Memorial, and that went on from all my student days, '59 and into the '60s, until the college adopted what we called for decades a new curriculum. In '67, '68, a new 67, 68, a new curriculum was installed. Along with that curriculum was a change in calendar. We dropped the 6-day, Saturday classes. It changed the format of classes to 60 minutes and 90 minutes from the old 50-minute, 3, 3, and 3. You're now 3, 2, 3, or 3, 2, and we eliminated the required chapel idea. Chapel wasn't just chapel; it was an assembly. And when we did that, we thought we were doing something that was very contemporary and da-da-da-da-da. We also pulled the plug on the sense of community, I think. And we languished. I think gradually we languished as a community and into a loss of sense of community because we never got together.
Mm.
And that continues to be, I think, a weakness in the college that you love and that I love. The only when are you together? You're a senior now, rising senior.
Mm-hmm.
When do you get together with a senior class, for example? Next to never.
Yeah, I was going to
Exactly.
say matriculation, I think, was the last
Exactly.
time.
Exactly. Now, when do you get together with the whole student body at Hamden Sydney football game?
Yeah, football games.
I think that's a loss.
Mm-hmm.
That's a real loss. And as quaint as it might appear, that assembly period, which there were some religious things, that's no question that was the case,
Mm-hmm.
but that getting the whole student body together was a wonderful bonding experience because you saw everybody and everybody was together for a common purpose. There were religious services that took place there. They weren't especially Methodistic,
Mm-hmm.
but there were religious services which were an opportunity. It was an opportunity to lift up important values and truths about life and challenges to life. And we've lost that. And I think the institution suffers because of that. I don't think we ought to be apologetic. Personally, I don't think we ought to be apologetic about value systems, because
Okay.
all values aren't created equal,
Mm.
in my own humble opinion. And I think we would be a better institution, and probably we would recover something of what we've lost. We would recover our roots if we would find a way to go back to something like that.
Mm.
Personal opinion. But the 60s were different. The whole element, the era of freedom, and all that, the liberation movement, women's lib, the green movement that started, the Vietnam War, the opposition to the institution,
Mm-hmm.
all of that figured into this change. And I think that we've thrown the baby out with the bathwater.
Mm.
And maybe your generation of Americans will have to recover that, not just in a local sense, but institutionally,
Mm-hmm.
in terms of loss of values. Because I think all of us, all colleges, contributed to that when they let go things that were really important,
Mm-hmm.
I think.
Before we move on, I just had a quick question. I'd always heard people talk about chapel and how it was continued to be required until 70 or something like that. And then when I was going through Fishtails, I noticed assembly and chapel were two completely different things. So was it that assembly was required and chapel wasn't, or you said they were kind of blended, or?
Well, when I was, and I think that they were both, after the new curriculum,
Mm-hmm.
we did not have required assembly or required chapel. We had chapel, but it was on a voluntary basis, and assemblies were voluntary. We tried to carve out a time for community gatherings.
Okay.
We did that, but it was voluntary. So, in the era of freedom, I can do what I want. Nobody can tell me what I ought to do. I'm an adult. Duh.
Mm.
Right. I don't mean to cast
That's
aspersions
fine.
on young people, but absent some measure of coercion, eat your spinach because it's good for you.
Mm-hmm.
Your parents say. Without some element of coercion requirement, no human being is going to do things that are inconvenient. We sacrifice, I think, something good at the altar of convenience or popularity. But they were after the new curriculum and the demise, therefore, of the assembly period and the requirement, things went downhill. The chaplain would do chapels, but very few people would come. So you can do them in Blackwell Auditorium, and then you could do them in another much smaller space.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Let's see. I guess, do you feel that the relationship with the conference and with the Methodist Church, some would say that it's only maintained because of the high number of alumni that are in the conference from, I guess, the 50s and 60s when the pre-ministerial program was really strong here. Do you foresee that relationship continue to be supported by the conference and by the administration here at the college? And is it significant in any way other than just historical significance?
In my opinion, the significance of the relationship is not merely historical. It is not primarily historical. From my perspective, looking at the college's educational philosophy expressed in the college's mission statement about educating the whole person.
Mm-hmm.
From that perspective, I think our relationship with the denomination, happens to be Methodist, it could be whatever, is an important opportunity that the college should take advantage of. And I think the extent to which we have been, or have appeared to be, value neutral is a colossal mistake. And if you want, again, in a personal perspective, if you want to see evidence of that, look at American society. Look at how we are searching for values, and that we have demonstrated day after day in news media, the loss of any touch with significant values. It seems to me. So I think that there's a great opportunity there, and I would hope that the college would not turn its back on that, or not attempt to be neutral and avoid offending anybody. If you're gonna make omelets, you got to break eggs. And if we're going to create, I think, if we're going to transmit the best in civilization in our little piece of the world, I think we have to talk about values. And I think that theological values are at the core of all of that. I don't think we have to be Methodist, but I think we have to talk about things that are of fundamental importance to what it means to be human. And I think it would be a terrible mistake for the college to disconnect from the church, even if, as seems to me likely, even if the church in dire financial times says we can no longer ask our people for a $1 million education fund, which the annual conference does. It's about $1 million or $1.2 million, and then split that money up among the six. Even if they can't afford to do that, that is no reason for Randolph-Macon or for Randolph or for Wesleyan or Shenandoah or Ferrum to say, thank you, we are out of here. No reason for that. The basis for the thing, it's not a quid pro quo, to my way of thinking. It's much more fundamental and profound than that. It's not about money. It ought to be about something else. And I feel passionately about that, as you can see, and I just think too much depends on it. And I just hope that Randolph-Macon will not see this as an opportunity to disconnect because it's unpleasant talking about alcohol or this, that, or the other. No. We have to retain that. That would be a sad day. It would be a sad day, a tragic day, if the college were to turn its back on the church, or the church were to turn its back on the college. And I don't care whether we get money or not.
Right.
Oh, I care, but that's not the fundamental reason for that relationship. I think it's just as important now as it was in 1830. More important now than then, because the world has changed.
Do you think that relationship could be more difficult to maintain with fewer students from Randolph-Macon graduating and going into ministry, particularly the Virginia Conference?
Yeah. Well, not really. Not really. I think what the church would want, if speaking as a member of the annual conference, what I would want is not submission to. We're not a creedal church. United Methodism, unlike Roman Catholicism and the Anglican Church and Lutherans and Presbyterians to some extent, we're not Presbyterian. We're not creedal. But so I'm not looking for that. What I would be looking for is paying attention um, to Judeo-Christian values. You don't have to use those terms. I can be very ecumenical about how I refer to that, but values that are fundamental, I think, in what it means to be human and how human beings live out their lives on this planet. What they pay attention to, what they affirm as important markers in individuals. That's, to me, what it's about. So I think that I think the college could do a number of things to satisfy the conference at that point, if we wish to do so, and to maintain a strong and maybe a more vigorous relationship, because there would be no sense of quid pro quo. It would be rather a sense of shared values and shared vision for what the world can be. That would be the binding point, because I think education and religious values are not inimical. I don't want to subscribe to the notion that that you have to pick on common issues. That evolution is the enemy of Christianity or religious. That's just bull. That's just not. That dog will not hunt. So I think that there's plenty of common ground for an academic institution and for an ecclesiastical institution to maintain a partnership to the benefit of humanity.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for being here today and for being so willing to share your thoughts. Do you have anything else you'd like to add?
I'm glad to do this, and good luck on transcribing all this for your project.
Well, thank you very much.
Okay.